All right, so get ready. We're diving deep into a period that, well, let's just say it was a wild ride for the young United States. The early republic, expansion, growing pains, and, yeah, simmering tensions that would eventually boil over.
A lot like that awkward teenager phase, right?
Exactly. Full of energy, figuring things out, testing boundaries, maybe getting into a little trouble along the way. And to guide us through this coming-of-age story for America.
We've got a chapter from a history textbook, but trust me.
Yeah, this is way more exciting than those dusty old books you might remember.
This one is juicy.
Okay, so let's jump right in. What jumps out at you from this period?
The war is 1812. It wasn't just about, winning battles. It was a turning point. Psychologically, imagine you're this young nation. You finally prove yourself on the world stage.
Second War of Independence, right?
Right. Huge for national pride. But it also kind of exposed some weaknesses.
Okay, so kind of like, realizing you can run a marathon, but your knees need work.
Yeah, exactly.
So it wasn't just about breaking free from Britain anymore, but becoming stronger, more self-sufficient.
Exactly. The war, it really highlighted how fragile the financial system was, how much we relied on foreign goods, and wow, the transportation issues.
And suddenly, investing in things like banks and manufacturing and, roads and canals, it wasn't just an idea.
It was urgent.
So that's where we get the Second Bank of the United States, right?
1816.
Trying to bring some order to all that financial chaos.
Exactly. Stabilize the currency, regulate credit, make trade easier. But it was definitely controversial. A lot of people thought it gave the federal government too much power, favored the wealthy elites.
Ah, so that tension between national goals and, individual liberty, states' rights, sounds familiar.
Oh, yeah, some things never change.
Yeah.
But even with all the political drama, there's this incredible energy in this period.
Right. The sources, they talk about New England just exploding with an industrial growth. What fueled that?
Water power, rivers, streams, harnessed to power all those early factories, especially textile mills. And you've got brilliant inventors like Francis Cabot Lowell who figured out how to mechanize textile production.
So it's not just resources, it's innovation. And I bet the government wasn't just, watching from the sidelines.
No way. They stepped in with tariffs to protect those young American industries from foreign competition. Plus, there was this constant debate about funding internal improvements.
Roads,
Yeah.
canals, all of that.
Exactly.
Internal improvements, it sounds so boring. But I get it. I mean, we take, paved roads and Amazon Prime delivery for granted.
Right.
But back then, moving stuff or people was a huge deal.
Huge. And that's why steamboats were revolutionary. I mean, think about it. Traveling upstream against the current, opening up the Mississippi River, all those tributaries, it changed everything.
Yeah.
Trade, settlement, communication.
It's like the internet of the 1800s.
Right.
And speaking of game changers, our source mentions Robert Fulton's steamboat journey, 1807, New York City to Albany in just 32 hours.
150 miles.
That must have blown people's minds.
It did. It wasn't just technology. It was like suddenly the distances seemed smaller. More possibilities. Fueled westward expansion.
Okay, so economic growth, innovation,
Yeah.
and now the allure of the West.
Right.
What was driving people to, pack up and head out into the unknown?
Well, you had things pushing them from the east, growing populations, not enough land.
And the West was pulling them with promises of cheap land, resources, adventure.
Exactly. And of course, the government played a role too, encouraging settlement and sometimes, forcibly removing Native Americans from their lands.
A complicated part of the story.
It is. A lot of it was fueled by this belief in manifest destiny, this idea that America was destined to expand across the continent, which often led to conflict with Native Americans.
So it's not just a simple tale of pioneers and, cowboys.
Sure.
It's about displacement, cultures clashing.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting how the sources highlight those regional differences in westward migration. You have the Old Northwest, the Old Southwest, and the Far West, each with their own vibe.
Yeah. The Old Northwest, what we think of as the Midwest today. It was mostly families looking to start farms, build communities, like they had back east.
While the Old Southwest, down in the Deep South, it was all about those big plantations, right? King cotton.
Yes, and unfortunately, the expansion of cotton went hand in hand with the expansion of slavery, which would, of course, eventually tear the nation apart. And then you have the Far West, rugged individualism, fur trappers, mountain men, where the allure of adventure, maybe getting rich quick, often outweighed the dangers.
Right. Our source even mentions this amazing illustration depicting those mountain men. It just captures that spirit of independence.
Definitely. And it reminds us that the West wasn't just a place, it was an idea. Opportunity, freedom, the unknown.
And explorers like Stephen Long. They played a big role in shaping how people saw the West, especially the Great Plains.
His expeditions, they gave valuable information about the geography, the resources, but his descriptions of the Great Plains as dry and not good for farming, well, that led to this idea of the Great American Desert, which really shaped settlement patterns, delayed development for years.
It's like how exploration and science, they were tied to how people thought about the land, what it could be used for.
Exactly. And speaking of evolving ideas, our deep dive takes us to a pretty dramatic chapter, the acquisition of Florida and the First Seminole War.
Oh, yeah.
This was a region where tensions had been simmering for years, settlers pushing into Spanish Florida, conflicts with the Seminole Indians, enslaved people escaping across the border.
The power cave.
Exactly. And then enter Andrew Jackson, hero of the War of 1812. He leads a military campaign into Florida in 1818.
It goes for it.
He does.
Yeah.
Seizes Spanish forts, sets off the First Seminole War. Jackson was a man of action.
Definitely not one to wait for permission.
No. His actions, well, they were controversial, but they forced Spain's hand. Led to the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, Florida is officially part of the U.S., another major expansion of American territory.
So the U.S. is expanding, the economy is booming, it's flexing its muscles globally. But internally, there are these deep divisions, simmering tensions.
Right.
And yet, this period is called the era of good feelings. Was it really all that harmonious?
The name, it's a bit misleading. The Federalist Party, they pretty much disappeared after the War of 1812, so it felt like one big happy political family.
I got it.
But beneath the surface, new political fault lines were emerging.
The sources mentioned the Panic of 1819, the first big economic crisis in the U.S. I'm guessing that didn't help the good feelings.
Not at all. It revealed weaknesses in the financial system, sparked debates about the government's role in the economy, and really highlighted the growing gap between the North, which was becoming more industrial, and the agricultural South.
So progress and expansion, but also growing pains and those deep divisions, like that teenager we talked about.
Yeah.
Growing fast, full of energy,
Yeah,
but maybe prone to stumbling a bit.
exactly. And those growing pains, they're going to get even worse in the 1820s, leading to new political factions, and, well, things are going to get really interesting, but that's a story for our next segment. So, yeah, those growing pains, they definitely get more intense in the 1820s.
And one of those, like those moments where those tensions really, really surfaced.
The Missouri Compromise, 1820, it was
Yeah.
a turning point. It showed just how divided the nation was over slavery
Yeah.
and where it could, where it could and couldn't exist.
So, like, paint the picture for us.
Yeah.
What was going on that made this compromise such a big deal?
Well, Missouri wanted to join the Union as a state,
Right.
right? Which would have given, slave states more power in Congress.
Right, right.
And the debate was fierce. Months of arguments, passionate speeches in Congress. You can just feel the tension, the worry, like what's going to happen to our country?
High stakes. So, how did they even reach a compromise with everyone so fired up?
Well, it was delicate, right? Missouri, it comes in as a slave state. But to keep things balanced, Maine, which was part of Massachusetts, becomes a free state.
Okay, so the balance in the Senate stays the same.
Right. But to appease the folks who really didn't want slavery to spread, they also banned it north of the 36° 30 aural parallel in that Louisiana Purchase territory.
Okay, but isn't that just like kicking the can down the road, avoiding the real issue?
You're right. It was a temporary fix. The compromise didn't actually address the political questions around slavery. It just papered over those cracks in the nation's unity. Like Thomas Jefferson said, that whole slavery debate, he called it a fire bell in the night.
Oh.
Like a warning that this wasn't over.
Yeah, like they knew this issue could blow up the country,
Yeah.
but they were hoping it wouldn't. So much drama. And amidst all this political drama, we've also got these legal developments, the Supreme Court. And our sources, they really emphasize this guy, John Marshall. He's the Chief Justice for like over 30 years.
He was huge.
Sounds like he was a pretty major player.
He was a staunch Federalist. He really believed in a strong national government. And his rulings in a bunch of key cases, well, they really strengthened federal power, sometimes at the expense of, states' rights. He was brilliant. He knew how to interpret the Constitution to expand the reach of the federal government, shape the balance of power for generations to come.
Yeah, the sources mention several of those big cases, like Fletcher v. Peck, Dartmouth College v. Woodward, McCulloch v. Maryland, Gibbons v. Ogden. So these weren't just like legal technicalities. There were real-world consequences.
Big time.
Like what happened with Fletcher v. Peck?
Well, that one basically said contracts are sacred. States couldn't just interfere with them, even if even if they involve some shady business.
Oh, interesting. So even if there was something, a little corrupt in how that contract was made.
Court said, hands off.
It was a win for businesses.
Yeah.
Set a precedent for protecting property rights.
Right. And then there's Dartmouth College v. Woodward, which extended those protections to corporation charters.
So the state couldn't just change the rules on a whim.
Exactly. Another win for contracts. And it limited how much states could regulate corporations.
It sounds like these decisions, they were paving the way for a more business-friendly environment where contracts were solid, corporations had, more legal protection.
Exactly. And that pattern continued under Marshall's leadership.
Always siding with a broader interpretation of federal power.
Right. Often over states' rights.
And I guess the biggest case of all was McCulloch v. Maryland. That was a real showdown, right?
Oh, yeah. It was the state of Maryland versus the Second Bank of the United States.
Right. That institution that we were talking about. That was created to bring some stability to the financial system.
Right. So Maryland, they tried to tax the bank's operations in the state. But the Supreme Court, with Marshall at the helm, they said, nope, can't do that.
Interesting. And why not?
Their reasoning was huge. They basically affirmed this principle of implied powers. They said, Congress has the authority to create the bank, even though the Constitution doesn't explicitly say they can.
Wait, so the court was saying the Constitution gives Congress powers that aren't even written down.
Right. And that decision had massive consequences. It established a precedent for the federal government to do things that, aren't specifically listed in the Constitution. It really, really strengthened the national government and paved the way for future expansions of federal authority.
Wow, that's a game changer. So what about Gibbons v. Ogden? That one was all about interstate commerce, right? Which seems like a recipe for conflict between states.
It totally was. In Gibbons v. Ogden, the court said that the power to regulate commerce between states, that belonged solely to Congress, not the states themselves.
So only Congress could make the rules about trade between states.
Exactly. This had a massive impact on the national economy because it gave the federal government the power to regulate a whole bunch of economic activities.
So to sum it up, John Marshall's Supreme Court, it really expanded the power of the federal government, put limits on states' rights, and kind of laid the groundwork for a more unified national economy.
Exactly. Marshall's impact is undeniable.
Absolutely. And while all this is happening domestically, the U.S. is also making moves on the world stage. Latin American revolutions, they were throwing off Spanish rule, right?
Yeah.
Creating opportunities, maybe some anxieties for the U.S. And this is where we get the Monroe Doctrine, right?
Right. 1823. It was a bold statement. Basically, the U.S. declared that the Western Hemisphere off limits to any new European colonization and warned European powers not to mess with those newly independent nations in the Americas.
The stay out of our backyard kind of statement.
Yeah.
But was it just a bluff? Did the U.S. actually have the muscle to back that up?
At the time, it was more about, stating a principle. The U.S. Navy wasn't exactly a global superpower yet. But the Monroe Doctrine, it showed that America, it had ambitions, to be a major player in the Western Hemisphere, and it was willing to protect its interests in the region.
It's so interesting how the U.S. is dealing with all this internal division and at the same time, trying to assert itself on the world stage.
It's a balancing act.
Like those two things, expansion abroad and conflict at home, they're tied together.
Definitely. And as we move into the late 1820s, those internal divisions, they become even more intense.
No.
The era of good feelings, it's over. And new political factions are emerging.
So, sounds like we're headed for another big turning point in American history.
Yeah.
What's driving this revival of political opposition? What's changing the political landscape?
Yeah, those fault lines, they were getting deeper. And as the nation expanded, different regions, they had different priorities,
Right, like the economy was changing, growing in different ways.
Exactly. The North, with all its cities and factories, they wanted tariffs, to protect American-made goods. But the South, they depended on exports, like cotton. So they didn't like tariffs because it could make imported goods more expensive.
So it's kind of the beginning of that classic North-South divide that eventually leads to the Civil War. Were these economic differences the main thing driving those new political groups?
They were a big part of it, for sure. But there were also some deeper philosophical differences about the role of government. The National Republicans, who would later become the Whigs, they believed in a strong central government, one that could actively promote economic development, things like the American system.
Oh, right, the American system.
Yeah.
Remind me what that was all about.
It was like a grand plan, championed by folks like Henry Clay. It was all about tariffs to protect American industry, internal improvements, roads and canals to connect the country, and a national bank for stability.
So a vision of a more connected, economically powerful nation with the federal government, leading the way.
Exactly. But not everyone liked that vision.
Right, right.
The Democrats, led by Andrew Jackson, they were more skeptical of federal power. They were all about the little guy, the farmers, small businesses. They saw the American system as something that just favored the wealthy and messed with the free market.
So two very different visions for America. One side wanted a more active role for the federal government. The other wanted less government involvement, more individual freedom.
That's a great way to put it. And these two visions, they really clashed in the elections of the 1820s, especially that crazy four-way race in 1824 where nobody got a majority of the electoral votes.
Wow. So it went to the House of Representatives.
It did.
So who were the big players in all of this?
Okay, so you had John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. He was representing those national Republicans.
Right. Strong federal government.
Exactly. Then there was Andrew Jackson, the war hero, the man of the people. He was all about limited government appealing to the average guy. And then Henry Clay, brilliant speaker, the mastermind behind the American system, and William H. Crawford, kind of representing the old guard, the traditional Democratic Republicans.
What a lineup. It sounds like a clash of personalities as much as a clash of ideas. So who came out on top?
Well, it was John Quincy Adams who ultimately won the presidency, but it was super controversial because he got Henry Clay's support in the House, and Jackson's supporters, well, they called it a corrupt bargain.
Oof. I can see why they were upset.
Oh, yeah.
Sounds like there was unfinished business.
Oh, yeah. That controversy fueled the fire and led to a rematch between Adams and Jackson in 1828.
In 1828, that was a landmark election, wasn't it? Mass campaigning, rallies, slogans.
It was a whole new level of public engagement.
It transformed American politics.
It did, and it was brutal. Both sides just going at it, and Jackson, he really played up that man of the people image against the elitist Adams, and he won big time.
So Jackson's victory, it really ushered in a new era, a more, participatory democracy. The common citizen having a voice.
Exactly. It was a turning point, a reflection of the growing power of the West, the rise of, democratic ideals, and Jackson's presidency. Well, it solidified the power of the executive branch and led to a whole lot of change and reform.
Wow, what a journey. We've covered so much ground. Expansion, conflict, transformation. It's been a wild ride through a pivotal time in American history.
It really has.
So if there's one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this, what would it be?
I'd say it's to understand that the early republic, it was this time of amazing progress, but also a time when those divisions, those cracks, they were already forming. They were building the nation, the economy was booming, people were moving west. But those seeds of conflict over slavery, over states' rights, the very nature of American democracy, well, they were planted right then.
It's like history is never just one thing.
Right.
It's triumphs and tragedies.
Absolutely.
Progress and setbacks all woven together.
And understanding this era, it's essential if we want to understand the challenges, the opportunities we're facing today.
Couldn't agree more. It's all connected. Well, this has been an incredible exploration of, this truly pivotal time in American history. And as always, we encourage our listeners to keep digging deeper, to question assumptions, and to, engage with the past, because understanding where we've been is essential for navigating where we're going.